So we go back a ways, 1994. I joined the Niagara Divers on a weekend charter to Kingston. David had been with them for years and a very active diver. I was sort of the new person on the boat and fell in love with this great group. So after a great weekend of diving, I joined their club, and little did I know what I was in for. Over the next 12 months with David, I did 175 dives here in Ontario. We dove literally every single weekend. I learned, to dive doubles, got into a dry suit, so forth. So it was, as you say, jumping in with both feet. That, of course, led David and me to wanting to sort of learn more about shipwrecks, and we joined SOS, Save Ontario Shipwrecks. For any of you in the audience that are shipwreck fans, I encourage you to join this. The group's organization is maintaining and preserving our marine heritage. The other thing that SOS does, and especially if you're a shipwreck fan, is what's called NAS training. So it's your Nautical Archaeology Society from Britain, has a series of, in a sense, classes you learn in order that you could go, in a sense, be an underwater archaeologist. So if you wanted to go out to a site and you had your NAS card, whoever's running that site would know you have the right skills to lay a baseline, not damage items, how to do measurements, and so forth. The other huge part of NAS, though, which I encourage for shipwreck lovers, is you learn about what parts are in a ship. So when you go down there and you see that pile of boards on the bottom, is that, the capstan or is that the windlass? And what is the difference? And what is, the mooring, and what is a hawser hole, and so forth. So this is a weekend-long course. You do a Friday evening, you do a Saturday all day, and a Sunday all day. You start out in the classroom, you eventually move to some land activities, you do some underwater pool, and eventually there's an open water dive that you do in order to, in a sense, qualify under your NAS certification. And then again, later, if you do your NAS 1, you can go on to NAS 2. So for the shipwreck lovers, I encourage you to look into this. It was canceled last year with COVID, but I am certain that later this year, most likely well later into the season, there will be NAS courses running again. From there, David and me, after we sort of learned more about ships and wanted to protect them, got involved with a gentleman named Ian Marshall with the Niagara Divers, who formed the Lake Erie Eastern Basin Mooring Project. So again, now that we realize the importance of protecting the ships, one of the best things to do is put down what are called mooring blocks. So you put down large cement blocks on the shipwreck. So our group takes care of the wrecks in the Eastern Lake Erie, as well as the Tiller wreck at Port Dalhousie, some of you might have dove. So huge 4,000-pound cement blocks are put on the bottom, just off from the ship, and then ropes are run to the surface to mooring buoys. This way, dive boats can show up, not drop an anchor into a shipwreck and damage it, tie up, divers can safely go down to the wreck, experience the wreck, and come back. So our club is very active in putting the moorings out each year, bringing them back, maintaining them. It's sort of a lot of work, but it is, a passion, and I want to say a passion of love for us for the shipwrecks. So then along came a big worry. I got married and had a couple kids. And I think Dave freaked out and was worried he'd lost his dive buddy. He was going to have to break somebody new in and start all over again. But little did he know, I didn't actually have a couple kids. I had a couple dive kids. You've actually seen my daughter, a lot of you presented here several weeks ago, and they're both avid divers. So now that he was rest assured of that, he got us into Trimix. So Dave was one of the first divers to be doing Trimix way back in the late 1990s in Ontario. So we were mixing tanks in our basement when people didn't even talk about nitrox because it was such a scary gas that nobody would ever dive. And you can, of course, see by his little dive computer there that we would regularly bend because they weren't certified to go to this depth, but we were getting down to a lot of the much more deeper wrecks that are around the province. From there, we met David Trotter. Many of you will know as one of the greatest shipwreck hunters in the Great Lakes. So we then proceeded to spend many, many weekends with David hunting for shipwrecks, running side scan sonar on the bottom of Lake Huron. David Trotter personally has side scanned over 20% of the entire surface of Lake Huron, a phenomenal achievement in his life. Has found many, many wrecks. David and me have been very fortunate that since those who sort of search get to dive. So some of the wrecks that he has found, as you can see on that, the graph that he's sitting at, we were fortunate to go out and be some of the first divers to experience those wrecks. And before anybody asks in the question and answer period, David Trotter never gives out the location of the shipwrecks he finds. So we would shoot the footage and turn it over to David to use, and then later we get to have it back for ourselves. But we are sworn to lifelong secrecy of their locations to help protect them. We've also both been involved with the Ontario Marine Heritage Committee, who actively do research and, in a sense, site sort of drawings. So just even this past year with COVID, we were up with good, social distancing, doing a shore dive at Lion's Head, and surveyed the Sirenian and produced many drawings of what the timbers looked like and so forth. For those of you that are maybe just snorkelers in the group and aren't actually scuba divers, the Sirenian at Lion's Head Harbor, which is just down from Tobermory, is a whopping 6 feet deep. So you can go out there in your snorkeling equipment and experience several really fun little shipwrecks that are quite photogenic in just feet of water. So one of the other things that's very important I'd like to mention with shipwreck diving is what's called low impact diving. We don't want to be damaging these historic wrecks, and in some cases hundreds of years old. So I encourage you to work on your buoyancy skills before becoming a wreck diver. And one of the best places to do that is to go to some type of contained site. So the Niagara Divers, along with several other clubs and dive shops in the Niagara area, of course, built the Welland Scuba Park. This lies in the old Welland Canal up from the Flatwater Rowing Center, and has a large ship that we sunk, what looks like an actual little Russian nuclear submarine. It's an old gas station propane tank that we built with a conning tower and propeller and converted. There's a couple cars and so forth. So it's a great place to go and practice, work on your buoyancy skills, work on new gear. For those of you that haven't dove it, I encourage you to get down to Welland and have a great fun time. Our dive club, as you can see, has regular events there, from Canada Day to pumpkin carving dives. Great place to go down and have fun as a group. So as you can see, David and me sort of, after all these years, tend to even almost look together. We got the same cameras, the same lights. As Catherine mentioned, after 1,000 dives and almost 30 years together, we really do have a passion for shipwrecks, and enjoy it mostly when we're together underwater. So back to what we're here for tonight. You guys are all here because you obviously have a huge passion for shipwrecks. So tonight's presentation, before we get started, I want you to keep in mind, what type of wreck diver are you? And no, I'm not talking about, do you wear a hard hat or doubles or signals? Are you a wet diver or a dry diver? What I'm talking about is, what is the sort of classification or genealogy of shipwrecks? So just like this chart that shows like animals and plants and that all sort of classification system, there's a classification for wrecks. So if we start at the base, there are saltwater wrecks. Many of us don't want to dive up here in the Great Lakes. We want to put on a bathing suit, go down to some nice warm water, maybe dive something like the Spiegel Grove or the Duane or the Mighty O. Some of the great shipwrecks are on Florida's Shipwreck Trail. So saltwater wrecks are one type. The other type, of course, are freshwater wrecks. Of course, water's colder, but you get something like this. This is a picture David took of the Comet, which is out in Kingston. These are 35-foot paddle wheels. This went down in 1861. And they are still sitting here 170 years later, 35 feet off the bottom, straight upright. So we have freshwater wrecks, we have saltwater wrecks. Our next sort of level up the tree is, what type of wreck is it? So is it a big steel freighter, or is it something like the Maple Dawn with boilers and engines, or is it an old wooden sailing ship? In this case, this is a bark. Just like the Windy 8 up at the Alpena Reserve in Michigan. So now we sort of got salt and fresh, we've got either steel or wood. Next up the tree is, how did it become a shipwreck? So was it some type of accident or storm that, in a sense, sunk her and sent her to the bottom? Or was it something a lot more ominous and mysterious, like the Kraken? Or, as you guys might remember from my daughter presenting a couple weeks ago, something like the curses that, doomed the Wyoming, right? But another type of wreck that's very common these days is artificial reefs that were scuttled. David and me were part of the group that would go up every weekend and clean the Niagara II when she was docked at Tobermory. It was then later sunk by the Tobermory Maritime Association. We were fortunate to get on the lead boat way back in 1994 when they sunk this. All those flames and explosion were done by the Canadian military just for show. The wreck really had huge holes already cut in the bottom and covered in wooden hatches. And a small charge you could barely even hear or see blew out those hatches, and the wreck slowly went down. Again, there was a draw occurred to see who got to be the first divers the next day. Well, you can guess which two divers won the draw. So David and me were very fortunate the next day to be on that first dive boat. And here's Dave literally swimming through the open windows that had been removed past the ship's binnacle and wheels on that very first day of diving on the Niagara II. So as we again move almost to the top of our tree now at shipwreck classifications, if we take an old ship and we sink it into salt water, well, within years, who knows, even just 10 years, this is what you get. You can't even barely tell that's a shipwreck down there anymore. But those same shipwrecks that go down, and of course freshwater, 150 years later, they still look like that if you brought them up, they could sail again. So wheels intact, looking just like, clean it off, and there's still paint on the handles. So our first presentation tonight, we're going to talk about the R.H. Ray, which is a wooden ship. And then after our questions period, we're going to talk about a steel ship, which is the Alpena's Lost Empire ship. So I want you to all, though, think about during our presentations tonight, later when we sort of have the open Zoom portion of the meeting near the end, what type of wreck diver are you? We're going to be asking that question of everybody later on tonight. Are you wood? Are you, salt? Are you freshwater? Are you steel wrecks? What type of shipwreck do you love? Locked beneath 100 feet of cold Lake Ontario darkness lies a time capsule of history. So please sit back and relax and join me as we descend beneath the waves and travel back in time to explore the wreck of the R.H. Ray. The Great Lakes, the world's largest inland waterways. From the mouth of the St. Lawrence River to Duluth, Minnesota, ships are able to travel over 3,000 kilometers into the heart of North America. For the past 500 years, thousands upon thousands of ships have plied these waters. From the era of wind and sail to today's massive Great Lakes carriers, the lakes have always been used as an efficient means of transport. But sadly, the lakes harbor a dark side, wide, deep, and cold. They forever seek to claim both sailors and ships who dare to venture upon them. Each year, the list of lost ships grows longer and longer, and since the first vessel was lost, we've been always drawn to find their final resting places. For most of us on this Zoom call, that desire to explore is what led us into scuba diving. So let me ask you a question. What makes for a great wreck dive? How about being the first diver on a wreck? In 1995, with Spencer Schonecker aboard the Brook Lauren, we had the privilege to be the first divers on the wreck of the Frontenac. Heading out for a dive, Spencer had a promising hit on his depth sounder, so we planned to do a quick bounce and see what it was. As we neared the bottom, out of the darkness appeared a wooden steam-powered tugboat. The wreck was not hard to identify. since you could still read its name across the stern. Sunk in 1929, it was in excellent condition, including its compass and wheel. It is hard to imagine that you could ever have a more better dive. But wait, what about diving a fully intact wreck? In 2003, we were part of Joyce Hayward's team that did the site survey on the wreck of the Windy 8 for the NOAA Preserve in Alpena, Michigan. The Windy 8 is so intact, it seems wrong to use the word wreck in the same sentence. Having been frozen in pack ice, she descended so slowly to the bottom that even the wooden hatch covers did not float off. Again, it is hard to imagine a better dive. But what about a wheel with a wheel, anchor, or bowsprit? For many of us, a wreck is not complete if it doesn't have a wheel. And if one wheel is good, then having 3 is truly outstanding. David is one of the few divers that has had the pleasure to dive the wreck of the Gunilda in Lake Superior. With its gold-trimmed bowsprit, anchors, and 3 wheels, it has to be one of the world's best shipwrecks. In 1911, the Gunilda grounded on a rock shoal and later sunk during the foiled attempt to pull her clear. Today, she sits in about 300 feet of ice-cold water, which has served to preserve her many artifacts. But let's face it, how often do you get to see a gold-trimmed bowsprit, or be the first diver to touch a wreck, or be part of a NOAA site survey? For most of us, a great dive is all about the mystery and history. That same explorer spirit that drew us to scuba diving in the first place keeps asking questions. During our first dive on the Ray back in 1998, I can remember asking, what type of ship is it? How did it sink? Who found it? Who has dove it? And has anybody ever died on it? For explorers, these type of questions always float through our minds as we float through the silence of the deep. And answering these questions can make for a truly great dive. So let's answer the questions and explore the explorer spirit in all of us. And in doing so, I hope to show you what a great dive the RH Ray is.
We start our story of the RH Ray in 1960 in the county of Prince Edward, Ontario. A young woman named Barb Carson, having grown up with shipwreck stories of the region, was gripped with the desire to explore. When her cousin, Lloyd Shales, started to sell some of the first scuba gear in the area, Barb jumped in, literally with both feet, and trained herself to dive. Over the next 3 years, she dove several wrecks and started researching the records in Kingston in hopes of finding a wreck for herself. In the spring of 1963, she was one of the first to get certification from the YMCA. In those early years, she and many others in the class had more experience than their instructors. A month later, Barb would find her first wreck. From that point on, she's played an instrumental role in finding a large number of wrecks in the Kingston area. Let's have a quick look at some of the wrecks she helped to find. In 1963, Bob Carson and Lloyd Shales were involved in the finding of the city of Sheboygan. Barb did most of the research work to locate the general area of the wreck southwest of Amherst Island. The research led to a quick find of the schooner. The 135-foot three-masted schooner City of Sheboygan was launched July 5, 1871 in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. After a 45-year career, the Sheboygan will make its last trip on September the 25th, 1915. The storm claimed the captain and crew of 4. Like many wrecks found in the 60s, many artifacts were removed from the Sheboygan. Today, these are on display in area museums, with the wheel on display in Point Traverse. The wreck today lies at a depth of 100 feet and still has many features for the divers to see, including a glass prism for letting light into the cabin below deck. Another unique item to see on the Sheboygan is the visible registration number on the hold opening. July 1963 saw the finding of the William Jameson by Lloyd Shales, Bob Carson, Ron Hughes, and John Birtwistle. The 100-foot schooner was launched in 1878 from Mill Point, Ontario. On Tuesday, May 15, 1923, during a spring storm, the 45-year-old William Jameson was leaking badly, and the crew made it to land safely after breaching the schooner on the shore of the North Shore of Amherst Island. Sadly, the anchors did not hold and the abandoned schooner drifted out and sank. Today, the wreck lies at a depth of 80 feet. The 173-foot schooner barge Aloha was found by Lloyd Shales and Bob Carson in August of 1964. The ship and captain were lost in an October storm in 1917 off Nine Point Island. While the rest of the crew survived, the wreck today lies at a depth of 50 feet. In 1993, Preserve RX Kingston sank the FMA next to her to enhance the site for divers. The George A. Marsh is one of the most popular and fatal wrecks in the Kingston area. It was found October 7, 1967 by Barb Carson, Ed Donnelly, and Ted Simons. The 135-foot three-masted schooner was built in 1882 in Muskegon, Michigan. 35 years later, on August 8, 1917, in a summer storm, the George A. Marsh was lost with her cargo of coal and 11 of the 14 crew, including the captain's wife and 5 children. The Marsh also has one of the most interesting stories that the supposedly lost captain of the Marsh turning up alive in Oklahoma 10 years after the sinking. Today, the wreck lies in 85 feet of water and is largely intact, with many artifacts such as the wheel, stove, yawl boat still on the wreck. The Marsh is very photogenic, being intact and having an impressive bowsprit. While not one of the deepest wrecks in Kingston, the Marsh has claimed more divers' lives than any other wreck in the area. The 108-foot two-masted schooner Annie Faulkner was located in 1975 by Barb Carson with Andre Rushbrook and Doug Pinfield. The Annie was launched in Kingston on May 22, 1865, 5 weeks before Canada became a country. November the 12th, 1904, in a violent storm, the Annie Faulkner and her cargo of coal were lost off South Bay Point. The crew made it to Amherst Island in the yawl boat. However, the first mate died of exposure after wandering away from the rest of the crew. Today, the wreck lies upright in a depth of 80 feet, with many of her artifacts to be seen, including the ship's wheel. The ship was well documented in 1982 by Preserve Ontario Shipwrecks. Some of the other wrecks Barb was involved in finding include the Katie Eccles in 1985 and the bow section of the Manola in 1976. But back to the story of the R.H. Ray. On August the 18th, 1976, Barb, along with her friend and fellow explorer Audrey Rushbrook, were searching for the wreck of the Burt Barnes. The Burt Barnes may look familiar to some of you in the audience, as it's the official flagship and logo of Save Ontario Shipwrecks, or SOS. Searching in that area was very difficult, as there was no side-scan sonar, GPS, or even Loran C. They would search their target area by running grids using landmarks, line of sight, and even the boat's wake. You can imagine their excitement when they got a spike on the paper readout from their depth sounder, which was only able to see directly below the boat. They geared up and dove down to find an intact schooner. The wreck appeared to match the Burt Barnes and was clearly of historical significance. Little did they know it would take more than 10 years before the wreck's true identity would be found. After the dive, Audrey used her sextant to note the latitude and longitude, and Barb fixed the location with landmarks. That day, they decided to keep the location of the wreck secret in order to protect it. Barb and Audrey were both instrumental in the founding of the Maritime Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston, so they applied for and received the salvage rights from the Canadian government. This allowed them to remove artifacts from the wreck with the purpose of putting them on display at the museum. Plans were made for photographing and documenting the wreck. Unfortunately, Audrey became ill and passed away the following year, so the wreck of documenting the wreck was put on hold. The Ray story continues in 1980 when Barb Carson learned that famed underwater explorer Jacques Cousteau had planned a visit to the Great Lakes with his converted World War II minesweeper, the Calypso. The main purpose of the visit was to explore the famous 1812 wrecks of the Hamilton and Scourge and to create a movie for the National Film Board of Canada. Barb, still thinking the wreck was the Burt Barnes, made an offer to Cousteau via the Kingston Marine Museum to explore a virtually untouched shipwreck she believed to have been built in the 1880s. Barb received the answer she had hoped for, and Cousteau would visit the shipwreck. She was hoping to get access to the footage and photographs that would be taken in order to help with her research on the wreck. Early on Wednesday, September 3rd, 1980, Barb Carson and Doug Pettingale met the Calypso and led the ship out to the wreck of the Barnes, which they had marked the previous day. After the Calypso dropped anchor, Bob and Doug tied off and were welcome aboard the Calypso. They watched as the helicopter headed out to take some aerial photos of the Thousand Islands and the Kingston area, while the dive crew aboard the Calypso suited up and got ready for their first dive on the wreck. That morning, 4 divers left the Calypso and boarded a Zodiac to take them over to the dive site and the wreck below for their first morning dive. After a while, some of the divers returned to the surface and the boat went into commotion. But with everybody speaking French, Barb and Doug did not understand at first what was going on. The Canadian Film Board representative came over and explained that one of the divers was missing. The divers returned to the water to look for the missing diver, but having only a short bottom time, they were not able to find him. At 11 a.m., the call went out from the Calypso that they had a missing diver, and a search and rescue team from Trenton responded with 3 divers being sent by helicopter. Around 2:45 in the afternoon, the body of 30-year-old André Gallino from Marseille, France, was found on the wreck and returned to the Calypso. Barb, who was trying to keep the wreck a secret while she continued to do her research, now found the existence of the wreck in all of the local newspapers. The Calypso returned to the wreck a week later and completed some more dives with Barb on board. The divers on those next dives were able to remove many artifacts from the wreck, including items of pottery, lights, crocks, deadeyes, as well as the ship's wheel. Barb had all of the Calypso crew sign a generic site plan that was being used to show the diver the general layout of the schooner, and on which the divers upon their return marked the location of artifacts they had removed. It would later be displayed at the museum in Kingston. Although Jacques Cousteau was not on the ship during any of the dives done on the Ray, his wife was on board and also signed the site plan. The items were taken to the university for preservation and conservation work. They would be displayed at Kingston Museum after the preservation was complete. A number of weeks later, the Calypso crew returned to the Kingston area from Montreal to see the work being done on the artifacts and to take additional footage for the movie. When the final film was made for the Canadian Film Board, there was no mention of the Barnes or the diver lost on the trip. Barb never did receive any of the footage or photographs taken on those dives. Many years later, a diver out with George and Suzanne of Ducks Dive Charters in Picton found the knife and dive table believed to have been from the lost diver. The period of these items and the fact that the dive tables were in French support this belief.
In the same period, Barb became close friends with Rick Nielsen, who loved to explore for shipwrecks and was very gifted in doing research. The work done on the wheel by the university uncovered patent markings. With much effort, Rick was able to track those down. That information, combined with other facts, led Barbara and Rick to the conclusion that the wreck was not the Burt Barnes. In the end, it still took them another 5 years of research to finally identify the wreck as the R.H. Ray. The Ray was built for the Ray Brothers and Company of Hamilton and was launched on October 5, 1857. Built in the Port Dalhousie shipyards of Donaldson and Andrews of St. Catherine, she was to be the flagship of the Ray Brothers shipping fleet. The local St. Catherine's Journal describes her as follows: "One of the most beautiful and, as nautical men assure us, most seaworthy barks ever set afloat from the Port Dalhousie shipyard. As a piece of naval architecture, she is pronounced second to none on the lakes, either for beauty, durability, or speed, and we have been informed she will pass at #1 with a star. Her length of keel is 135 feet, breadth of beam 26 feet, and depth of hold 11 feet 6 inches. Barbara and Audrey had at first identified the wreck as a schooner, but the Ray is actually a bark. The difference between them is how the sails are rigged. Schooners have anywhere between 2 to 7 masts, all rigged fore and aft with the sails running in line with the center of the ship. They require a smaller crew and can point higher into the wind, thus are more maneuverable. Barks have at least 3 masts, all of which the rearmost masts are square rigged. Vessels rigged this way would take better advantage of the prevailing winds and were used for long ocean passages. The Ray was built for the transatlantic trade, but it is unclear if she ever made it out of the Great Lakes. A couple of weeks after her launch, she made her first and only run of the 1857 season. The trip was to Chicago and back under the command of Captain Beaumont, but this maiden voyage did not go well. On leaving Port Burwell, Ontario, she grounded and jettisoned her deck load of lumber. After wintering in Hamilton, her first trip of the 1858 season was to Chicago, where she picked up a load of wheat and delivered it to Kingston, Ontario. The trip from Chicago to Kingston took 16 days, 7 of which is the transit of the Welland Canal. Following that, we have not found any records of her voyages for the next 3 months. 2 p.m., August 3rd, 1858 is the next chapter in the story of the Ray. Carrying a cargo of wheat just 40 miles east of Kingston, she was hit by a white squall and sunk. Everyone on board was picked up by the propeller colonist. 3 days later, the Kingston Daily News is quoted as follows. News was brought by the crew of the bark R.H. Ray that she was struck with a squall about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, capsized and sunk, going down so gradually as to enable Captain Beaumont, his wife, another female, and all hands to escape in the small boat. This occurred in the neighborhood of the Ducks, island so called in Lake Ontario. They saved nothing from the vessel and arrived here in the boat, utterly destitute, wet, and hungry. The following summer, Mr. Quinley from Detroit made an attempt to raise the Ray. A second attempt was made 8 years later by the Boston Maritime Company. While both attempts were unsuccessful, many items like the anchors and masts were removed. Many websites and books have listed that she was named after the famous Arctic navigator of the time. This is incorrect. She was named after Richard Honeyman Ray, born in 1911, one of 6 Ray brothers. John Ray, who in 1853 discovered on one of his Arctic trips the location of the ill-fated Franklin expedition, was born in 1913 and was Richard's younger brother. Research on the Ray can be very difficult since a schooner named John Ray also sunk off the Ducks in 1866. It was originally built as the John Heisman and then renamed in 1856 to John Ray. The wreck was recovered a year later and renamed to Duncan City. Part of the Ray's mystery is that she was built state-of-the-art for her time and no expense was spared in her design. Even so, she sunk less than a year after she was launched. An example of this is she is the first Canadian vessel to have Cummingham's patented self-reefing topsails. These enabled the crew to quickly furl or unfurl the topsails from the deck, thus eliminating the dangers of climbing high up into the rigging on a moving ship. Another piece of cutting-edge design was the patented steering gear made by E.B. Robinson of Boston. Attached to the rudder stock, a series of screws made the work of steering easier and steadier. This was also a key item in finding the wreck. In addition, 2 strong iron bars were placed abast of each mast down to the keelson. This was done instead of placing the masts at either end of the centerboard box. Movement of the mast quite often caused leaks in centerboard boxes, and this new design would eliminate that. Other improvements included a stronger deck design, improved windlass, and double bulkheads in case of collision. But as every Great Lakes sailor knows, no ship is strong enough when the spirit of the lakes throws forth her full fury. So now that you have learned the mystery and history of the R.H. Ray, who here is looking forward to logging a dive on this great wreck? The final chapter in our story today is a group of divers doing just that. In the summer of 2008, members of the Niagara Divers Association did a weekend charter to the Ducks, and on the afternoon of August 3rd at 2 o'clock, they found a great way to make a wreck dive even better. How many divers get to make a sesquicentennial dive? Yes, it was exactly 150 years to the hour that the Ray slipped beneath the waves and into history. As the club explored the wreck that day, there was no golden bowsprit, no upright masts, and no wheel. But all of them remembered it as a great dive since it was filled with mystery and history. 150 years of mystery and history. Okay, thank you for that. The 1930s, a time of political unrest in Europe. The Nazi Party, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, was growing in popularity due in part to Hitler's skill as an orator, coupled with German unrest. The economy had not recovered since their defeat in the Great War, World War I. Unemployment was high, and Hitler gave his countrymen a direction for blame: rich Jews, the Communist Party, and foreign neighbors. Italy and then Germany formed an alliance, and then by the late 1930s, the thought of war gripped the hearts of Europeans. The Americans, feeling securely isolated by two oceans, turned their thoughts to the World's Fair and the recovery from the Great Depression. Hitler's invasion of Poland brought to America the reality of war, when England and France appealed to America for help as they declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. Literally within hours of the declaration of war, the first shots were fired by Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, commander of the U-30, while keeping a lookout for armed merchant vessels spotted the Alpena. Alpena had left Glasgow September 1st and was carrying 1,100 passengers to Montreal. Lemp fired 2 torpedoes, one hitting Alpena amidships. She sunk with a loss of 112 passengers and crew. The main arm of the British Empire was the Royal Navy, and the biggest and most efficient in the world. Now engaged in a war with an unformidable and unseen enemy, ships would be in high demand. Nearly 1/3 of the world's merchant vessels were British, but Hitler promised an onset of hundreds of new U-boats that would strangle Britain. The term or prefix empire was given to ships which the Ministry of Shipping ordered for the government. These ships could be of any origin, built for war, purchased, war prizes, or ships requisitioned for the Ministry of Shipping, later to become the Ministry of War Transport, or MOWT. The Empire ship list indicates that 1,340 received the designation as Empire ships.
The Falstaff was built by Lethgo at Port Glasgow for the Ministry of War Transport in 1943 as a 447-foot, 7,000-ton cargo vessel. She survived World War II as an Empire ship and began her second life as a peaceful ship of commerce. By 1954, she had been given her fourth and final name, the Monrovia, from the port of Monrovia, Liberia. And by 1959, she was on her first voyage into the Great Lakes with a Greek captain and crew. On June 25th, the Monrovia, inbound to Chicago, had dropped her Canadian pilot at the Lake Huron lightship and departed at 2:15 a.m. A course of 353 degrees was set, and full speed ahead was rung up on the engine telegraph, carrying the ship at 9 miles per hour. By 3:40 a.m., visibility decreased with the onset of thick fog. While passing the harbor lighthouse, the light beam could not be seen, but the fog signal was heard. Although Monrovia did not have radar, no reduction in speed was ordered, and by noon, the master estimated her position off Thunder Bay based on 1 RDF bearing. Normally, a ship's position would be verified by taking 2 RDFs, or radio detection finding bearings, to trilaterate the exact position. However, the master chose instead to take 1 RDF edging and match that with a photometer sounding. At 1:35 p.m., fog signals from another vessel were dead ahead. The master ordered 1 blast on the signal as an invitation to pass port to port and ordered the rudder hard right. The Royalton on the port bow, barely visible in dense fog, now headed directly to the Monrovia. The Royalton, en route from Duluth to Montreal, did have radar and had been following the Monrovia closely, noting her position was outside the downbound course recommended by the Lake Carriers Association. As the radar target approached, the Royalton altered both speed and heading. Intercepted radio message referred to the target as a salty, now upbound on the downbound course. So the Royalton tried to reach the Monrovia by calling saltwater ship upbound on the downbound course, but no answer was received, and the collision became evident. A danger signal was sounded approximately 30 seconds before the impact. The Monrovia appeared out of the fog. Suddenly they met, and the Monrovia scraped her port side across the Royalton bow, ultimately placing a gap in the Monrovia's port side near the bridge. As the ships separated and began to assess damage, they lost sight of one another in the fog. The master of the Monrovia ordered the engineer to start pumping the holes, so the ballast suction lines were open. But before the pumps were engaged, he was called back on deck to abandon ship. And it should be noted that no check valves existed, so water was now entering the ship through the ballast lines. Within an hour, the 29-member crew had successfully abandoned ship and were rescued by the Norman W. Foy. The Monrovia was listing but sinking slowly, so the master and some of the crew reboarded the Monrovia to determine whether the flooding could be controlled. However, the open ballast lines were causing extensive flooding to the holds, and it was determined she could not be saved. The crew did, however, have time to remove personal belongings, and the ship did not finally disappear until 1:15 a.m. on June 26. By coincidence, later that same day, June 26, 1959, Queen Elizabeth and President Dwight D. Eisenhower participated in a historic ceremony officially opening the St. Lawrence Seaway. The loss of the Monrovia was the first loss of Sasalti, since the seaway had been made possible for foreign ships to frequent the Great Lakes. Early in 1970, Robert Massey of Massey Marine relocated the lost ship and began a massive undertaking to remove the valuable pleat steel and cargo. Work continued through Massey's Pan-Oceanic Engineering Corporation. Commercial diver Frank Troxel describes the methods used to recover the valuable steel.
The salvage effort on the Monrovia was to get access to the West German steel. There was a collision that sunk the Monrovia, and it was amidships. The pilot house had started moving to the port side and just bending over the cargo. Part of the hull was bent on the cargo, and the pilot house was offset from the center line. To what degree, I don't even think I ever knew. So we set off over a week's period of time and ended up setting off 2,500 pounds of high explosive to move the pilot house off the ship and the cargo. The largest shot we made at one time was 800 pounds. The explosive was made of 25-pound bags of slurry, which was mixed with high explosive, and an initiator, which was TNT. We used 2 cast blocks of TNT, 2 1-pound blocks of TNT, with holes cast in the center of it. We would duct tape a block around each end of the bag and run deck cord through both holes and then send one end down with the diver. The diver would go down to the work surface, tie off the deck cord somewhere under the wreck or deep inside, then get out. Pull it tight, then call up on the intercom, send down the next bag. We would slide it down, push it back under the wreck, and then the next one would be on the way. We would keep shoving them back into the wreck, and when we had them placed where we wanted, then we'd get out of the water. We would tie off the deck cord with a neo-electric detonator, move back 1,000 feet and touch it off, then go back and pick up fish.
The first fatality caused by the loss of the Monrovia occurred when commercial diver Franklin Bissett Jr. from Virginia suffocated by his air hose being pinched by steel during a recovery in 1972. Commercial diver Frank Troxel describes the methods and equipment used at that time.
We were using 2 types of, well, actually 3 types of dive gear. For quick inspections, we would use scuba gear. Standard 80 cubic foot sport diving rigged scuba gear. The main work hat or main work gear that we were using was an AH2 Aquadyne hard hat. It's a fiberglass hat, low volume hat, and a Kirby Morgan KMB 10 band mask. We would be making 5 dives a day in it, basically 5 10-minute dives to 130 feet. The recompression chamber was a double-lock 54-inch hyperbaric chamber that we maintained and kept for our own use. It was on deck at all times, and if there was an accident, and there were 2 incidents in the summer of 1981, where it came in wonderfully useful. I personally never needed it, but a couple of the other divers had a hit. They came up too fast. The last day, the 5th dive, and into the chamber they went.
During the 1980s, salvage on the Monrovia came to a halt as state law gave the DNR jurisdiction over sunken ships as historical and recreational objects. The site began to attract recreational divers who watched for perfect weather conditions to brave the 52-mile round trip from Alpena to Monrovia. This was an exciting opportunity to visit a ship with 2 unique histories: her first life as an Empire ship, and then as the first Salty lost after entering through the seaway. She was found to be a fascinating dive with intact deck houses, so many accessible rooms. There was much to see. Then, one late Sunday afternoon on August of 1981, 38-year-old recreational diver Norman Reebok accompanied a group to dive the Monrovia. He had been diving on the ship the summer before and was wildly enthusiastic about the many things to see. It was his 101st dive as he and his buddy descended to the deck to begin to examine the many passageways and rooms, planning to stay well above the bottom where the Monrovia rests at 140 feet. Reebok's partner began running low on air and signaled to ascend, but when he looked back, Norm wasn't there. He shined his light to signal the way, but he needed air and proceeded to the surface. Alerted divers rushed to the area where Norman had last been seen but could not find him. Perhaps he had become disoriented, began searching for an exit route, stirred up the silt, and lost visibility. He dropped his weight belt and eventually ran out of air. He was located 2 days later by the Michigan State Police Underwater Rescue Team. For the next 10 to 15 years, few divers visited the wreck, but in the late 1990s, visibility began to clear up with the early onset of zebra mussels. Between the clarity and the many intact sections of the ship, divers began making multiple dives on this 447 by 50-foot, 6-foot site. Beginning at the bow, the ship lifts dramatically to port, but divers can view the anchor, windlass, and small rooms in the forecastle, including the paint room. Behind the bow is the only area of the ship that is in disarray. A combination of collision and the explosives detonated to recover the valuable Belgian seal have created a bit of a mess here. The remains of the forward quarters and rooms below the wheelhouse are sometimes confusing and contain some loose cables and other debris that could catch tanks and gear. So it is recommended that divers stay with a buddy in this region of the ship. These rooms were once the captain's quarters, the chart and radio room, the officers' quarters, and the dining salon. All that remains of the now roofless wheelhouse is the empty binnacle post. Divers who enjoy poking around this area will find a lot to see despite the apparent disarray. This region of the ship was difficult to maintain bearings when visibility used to be far less than what we enjoy now. The divers would often deploy a line across the twisted bow past the destruction to the deckhouse, but the real fun begins as we travel aft.
After a full swim across a second section of hatches, we come to the main deckhouse area, which has sustained very little damage. The first room is easily recognizable since it's the only room aboard ship with bars in the window. The original plans do not show it as a jail or a holding cell as one might imagine on a Ministry of War transport, but rather it's the galley. A view of a large stove seen now as compared to early years shows the impact of zebra mussels. Behind the galley, one can visit a variety of small rooms, readily accessible from passageways to openings to a covered walkway. Here the divers can visit the carpenter's room, the pantry, the cook and steward's wash places, and an emergency or hospital room. Again, views before and after zebra mussels remind us of the trade-off for clear visibility we have now. Enjoy. A before dive orientation using the ship's plan indicate features in the area that cannot be seen any longer. The original plans of the Empire Falstaff show gun platforms, ammunition magazines, beds for 24 gunners and 12 firemen, and their wash places, and features that remind us of the serious risk taken by merchant ships of war and convoys. Any ship crossing the Atlantic was threatened by unseen U-boats. As ships crossed the Atlantic, bringing needed materials and manpower to Europe, it was stated, "The men suffer the tortures of the damned, never knowing when a tornado might tear through their plates of the hull, sending their ship plunging to the bottom." However, the ships and men continued their brave journey, for in the words of Churchill, the Battle of the Atlantic was the battle for Britain. It should be mentioned that nearly all of the newspaper accounts of the loss of the Monrovia have listed her as a Liberty ship. This is not accurate. Liberty ships, all 2,710, were mass-produced, sort of like prefabricated homes are today. All had the same dimensions and were built rapidly, section by section. Liberty ships were American, not British, and were given the nickname Ugly Ducklings by President Roosevelt, who complimented their capabilities of the ship, but was not impressed with their appearance. Liberty ships were soon replaced by faster Victory ships. Today, of the thousands of Liberty, Victory, and Empire ships that were in service during the Second World War, only a small handful remain. Continuing aft, divers will eventually come to a third and final deckhouse structure. As amidships, this area is filled with spacious rooms, small quarters, passageways, and windows. Dropping off to the stern, offers a picturesque view of the rudder and propeller. The maximum depth here is less than 150 feet. Our mentor, Joyce Hayward, has told us she'd lost count of the number of dives that she has done on the wreck since her first being introduced to the Monrovia by Bert Barker of Alpena many years ago. Each year afterwards, during her annual visit to the Alpena region, she would schedule a good day to pay her a visit, which we found remarkable considering Joyce's true love and passion was wooden sailing vessels. It was on one of these trips that we got the introduction to the wreck by both Joyce and Bert. And after a great weekend of diving, we have also fallen under its spell.
Our final view of the Monrovia will take us to a different level, from recreational to advanced or technical diving as we enter the ship's engine room. Here, the zebra mussels have not yet quite had the impact. Although silt is always an issue during penetration dives, the amount of silt the diver disturbed does not create a blackout, rather simply an annoyance for photography. Swimming into the engine room, the heart of the ship, we start thinking about that knowing the history of a ship adds a whole new dimension and excitement to the dive. What a fascinating area we find in the engine room. One can only wonder which of the many valves and handles might have been the very ones left in the open position, adding to the demise of the ship. Her story helps us make sense of the tour of the entire ship. We can imagine the man standing at the lathe, using the tools in the small machine shop to repair her machines of war. We can imagine the cook standing at the stove, preparing meals in the spacious galley, while glancing through the barred windows at the men moving around. We wonder when was the last time the paint locker was used, or what use was ever made of the hospital room. The vast chasm of this room allows us to descend past stairways and catwalks into the depths of the ship, and the deeper we travel into her engine room, the more we are reminded of those who served aboard the Monrovia when she was an Empire ship. We think of all the men who became trapped in rooms like this when the sudden blast of a torpedo ripped into their ship, which rapidly filled with water, making their escape impossible. We think of the men who spent hours here in the heart of the ship during stifling heat or frightening storms, or those who simply spent hours of hard labor day after day and night after night, enabling the ship to travel from one shore to another again and again. The quotation written by Sir Admiral Percy Noble is a fitting tribute to those who sailed upon Liberty, Victory, and Empire ships. He stated, "Day in, day out, night in, night out, these men in ships faced unflinchingly the dangers of the deep, prowling U-boats. They know, these men, that the Battle of Britain means wind and weather, cold and strain and fatigue, and all in the face of hosts of enemy craft above and below, awaiting the specific moment to send them to their death. They don't even have the mental relief of hoping for rescue if their ship is lost." But men who work and live aboard ships see past the danger and the work. They see past the monotony and the heat or the sickening pitching and rolling. And when the unthinkable happens, when their ship goes down, it is like losing a friend. As the Monrovia slowly filled and sank beneath the waters of Thunder Bay 11 hours after the collision, it was reported that the 29-man Liberian crew watched the radar screen intently from the rescue ship Foy. When the ship finally disappeared from the radar, the depressed crew turned away, and in the silence, one man was heard to say, "Well, that's it."
Now, we the divers take the place of the men moving about in the engine room. We view the panels once monitored by working men of war. We drift through cool waters where the men once sweated with the heat of their work and labored with unending duties. Yes, the journey of the Empire Falstaff has ended. It ended a long way from home, but it's certainly under better condition than most of her sister Empire ships. We no longer think of her as a ship of war. Those remnants of her other life were removed long ago. Now she is simply a fascinating dive site, one that we enjoy to visit again and again.